Today, my guest is Melissa Roman Burch, Chief Operating Officer of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Melissa leads EDC's real estate transaction services and asset management divisions, overseeing more than 200 assets, totaling over 64 million square feet. She also heads the Strategic Investments Group, structuring catalytic public-private deals that mobilize capital for growth in sectors like life sciences, green energy, and advanced manufacturing. Before joining the EDC in 2022, Melissa spent 2 decades in the private sector, including leadership roles at Lend-Lease and Forest City. She is a graduate of Harvard College and Business School. For those less familiar, EDC is the city's largest impact real estate company. It is a self-sustaining not-for-profit and not a city agency. The EDC manages its portfolio to a double bottom line of financial returns and social impact. Importantly, EDC also uses its portfolio as a policy laboratory, testing ideas on its assets, then scaling them citywide. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Raphael, thank you for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I look forward to diving in with you today.
Well, let's start at the beginning. I was told that when you were growing up, you wanted to be a New Yorker, and it's remarkable that you're here now, a quintessential New Yorker, and are actually shaping the future of the city itself. Tell us about your background and how you got into real estate development.
Sure. Well, I originally come from Ohio, and yes, had my eyes on New York City from a very early age in my life. I eventually came to New York, actually, after graduating from college, where I studied government as an undergrad. And my first role in the city was working in investment banking. But I found myself really figuring out how I could blend these two worlds. My interest in government and in public policy combined with my interest in negotiating, deal making, and capital formation. So I remember being so excited when I discovered the intersection of those two worlds, which I believe is really real estate development. And that set off the next 20 years of my career as I brought those two worlds together in what I refer to as my role as a civic developer, which is really the type of developer that I've been across the various roles of my life, where I've been largely working on large-scale public-private real estate developments that shape whole neighborhoods across New York City.
Fascinating background, and seems like a natural evolution to go to the EDC, but what was the turning point to leave the private sector into the public domain?
Well, first I had to be asked, and I want to thank Andrew Kimball, CEO of the Economic Development Corporation, for reaching out and saying, is this something that you would be willing to do at this moment in New York City's history? And what the real call to action for me was to come and be a part of the primary agency, the EDC, that was really going to shape New York City's economic recovery post-COVID. When you go back to 2022, it was not clear what the fate of New York was. And I felt that I had an opportunity to bring my experience from the private sector, to bring my experience in moving large-scale public-private partnerships and envisioning new ways for the city to develop, and to bring that into this public sector role. So I'm thrilled to have had that opportunity. And that really was the impetus. I mean, in many ways, it's sort of a continuation of this civic development mindset. And it's something that was a natural sort of evolution of having done that work for so many years from the private sector side, and now having an opportunity to be really catalytic in bringing that thinking to make sure that we could jumpstart New York, get investment flowing back into the city again, and take a very bold approach in thinking about how to activate our real estate and to shore up our central business districts.
Well, New Yorkers are fortunate to have you in your role. In our first episode, Professor Stan Van Nieuwburg described the urban doom loop, a cycle of office vacancy, fiscal stress, and urban decline. But you've argued that those doom loop narratives are overstated and that New York is already in a recovery. What makes you so confident in your views?
Well, first is to say that the urban doom loop, I think, was a really important scenario to understand in the do nothing scenario. So as we were really starting to come together, under the new government in 2022, as we were pulling out of COVID, one of the first things that Mayor Adams and Governor Hochul did was to convene a significant panel of civic leaders across business, academia, government, nonprofit, and that panel was called the New New York Panel. And its mandate was to really think in a very bold way about the question, if you can work from anywhere, why work from here? Why work from New York? And how do we ensure that our business districts remain vibrant and globally competitive? So with that major mission in mind, I think it was actually very helpful to have a straw man like the urban doom loop, because it was the case for what could happen if you did not take action. Of course, what did happen is that we put together a 40-point plan coming out of this panel that really set the course for all of the regulatory and legislative roadmaps of the last couple of years, with very strong partnership between the city and the state. So these were things like tax abatements for office to residential conversion, changing the zoning, and really thinking about creating our first public realm czar so that we could dramatically transform our cityscapes and create more dynamic streetscapes and places where people wanted to be, instead of business districts, social districts where people could live, learn, work, and play. And we're seeing the results of that. So fast forward now, and the 1 million jobs that were lost during COVID have now all been fully regained. And we actually have more private sector jobs in New York ever in the history of the city. So we not only regained all the jobs that we lost, but we have 153,000 more. We're seeing that our population is growing again. After bottoming out in 2022 in terms of people leaving the city, we're now seeing 87,000 people have come over the last year. This is double the number of our second place city in America, which is Houston, and more than Dallas, Atlanta, and Miami combined. So we're also seeing workers back in the office. 76% are either fully in person or hybrid. So you take all these measures together, including what's happening now in our office space with the leasing recovery that we've seen, which is that New York is leading the leasing recovery nationwide with 6 million square feet of net absorption in the last year. This is 3 times the amount of leasing in the second place city of Dallas. What we're finding is that all of these elements taken together show that the actions that were taken place in this new New York plan have actually translated into results. And through the backdrop of all of this is a tax base that has not been eroded. In fact, it's grown. We've had strong tax receipts, both in terms of personal income tax as well as property tax. And one thing that New York has done very well is that it has a very diversified tax base, collects taxes from a variety of sources, and that diversification has made sure that there hasn't been any one catastrophic exposure to any part of the tax base. So we're in a very strong position. The economy has really had incredible momentum over the last 3 years, though we are starting to see jobs slow, which is consistent with what's happening really across the country. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we believe firmly that New York City is not at risk of an urban doom loop and really has never been.
Well, beyond all those very positive macro and microeconomic factors, what are you seeing in terms of private investment, both domestic and international, that is also a positive signal for New York?
Well, we're seeing a lot of companies moving here, which is very exciting. We're seeing companies like Bridgewater Capital, Deloitte take on a massive expansion and help launch a brand new office building that's being built on the far west side. Chobani's created a new headquarters here. Disney, OpenAI. So we're seeing that companies are really looking at New York City as a place to invest, not only for leasing, but as they grow their businesses. And a lot of this, honestly, has to do with talent. Where is the talent located? The talent has spoken with their feet. We've seen 500,000 young college graduates moved to New York over the past couple of years. They're joining another 500,000 existing college students that are going to school here in New York City. And what you find is that New York City has one of the most highly educated, young, switched on talent bases, and companies want access to that. So we're really in a very strong, virtuous cycle where the companies want to be here because the talent is here, and the talent wants to be here because this is where their social networks are, their cultural networks, and people feel safe in the city again, and they see this as a place of opportunity.
You also often remind people that each borough is essentially the size of a major city on its own. You compare Brooklyn with its 2.6 million people to Chicago. How does that perspective shape the way you think about recovery and the city's economic resilience?
It's such a good question. And I think that we have to start out by saying that the mission of the EDC is really a 5-borough economic development corporation. And that is just fundamental to how we think about New York. And in fact, even in the work of the new New York Action Plan, which did have a very strong focus on Midtown and downtown as being sort of the major business centers, the report absolutely acknowledges, the need for investment in some of the other very prominent outer borough districts like downtown Brooklyn, where there's a very strong business and economic base, Long Island City, Jamaica. So there are a lot of different parts of this sort of, business investment story. But you're absolutely right. Each one of these boroughs is really the size of a major American city. And I think it gets obscured by the fact that when most people think about New York, they think we're talking about Manhattan. But I'm talking about all 8.3 million people. And yes, you're right. Brooklyn is the size of Chicago. So there's a Chicago-sized opportunity within that borough and then some, because it's also growing. There's a lot of interest in what's happening there, in particular on the coastline, which I know we'll get to in this podcast. You look at a place like Staten Island. Staten Island has the same number of people as the entire city of Miami. Yet we don't talk about Staten Island as having that sort of dynamism, and it does. In fact, we're investing $400 million into the North Shore of Staten Island, into a new esplanade that is really going to be transformative for investment and for housing production in Staten Island. That esplanade is going to connect all of the different parts of the North Shore to the ferry system, to the New York City ferry system, as well as to the Staten Island ferry, which means that there's going to be much easier mobility between Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. In addition, there's new housing sites that we're delivering as a part of creating this esplanade. You look at what happened at Brooklyn Bridge Park in Dumbo, or what happened at Hunters Point South on the Queens waterfront, and you see the results of where investments in public realm help attract and are a catalyst for private investment. And we expect the same thing to happen in Staten Island. I won't go through every single borough, but, Queens is the size of Houston. Bronx is the size of Dallas. So we have very deep, rich wells of opportunity. And each one of those boroughs has an ecosystem of housing needs, communities, and businesses that need to be understood. And that's what the EDC is here to do, is to help folks understand if they want to grow and if they want to invest in New York, we can connect them to those opportunities.
Great. Well, let's talk about an issue that's, spreads across all the 5 boroughs. New York is facing its sharpest housing crisis in decades. Vacancy at 1.4%. Affordability is stretched, and the mayor has a moonshot goal of creating 500,000 new units over the next 10 years. Let's dig into the big levers EDC and its partners are using to get there. Can you walk us through the 5 major initiatives underway?
Absolutely. So housing is no doubt the critical issue of our time. The city is in a housing crisis and an affordability crisis, and those two really interrelate. So this administration and this EDC has been hard at work, really moving the needle in probably some of the most meaningful ways that have really happened in the last 20 years in New York City. maybe even longer. I mean, the first of these is really the City of Yes for housing reform that was passed in December of 2024. This is the first citywide update to the zoning code since it was first put into effect in 1961. So this is epic. It creates the opportunity for a little bit more housing everywhere across New York City, including some neighborhoods that have literally been unable to generate any new housing in decades. It's taken a look at all sorts of things, including parking requirements. Why do we have such high parking requirements when we have a transit-based city and we have so many other forms of mobility that didn't exist in 1961? Many people don't realize that parking can be an inhibitor to market rate projects moving forward and, affordable housing projects moving forward for housing when they're burdened by outdated parking requirements. So that's just one example of how that reform is really moving the needle. It also significantly expanded the office to residential conversion opportunity, which we can get into more. But there was a date, which is 1961, and only office buildings that were built prior to 1961 could be converted, unless you were in Lower Manhattan, and then the date was 1977. But these dates have now been updated to 1990, sort of opening up about 136 million square feet more of opportunity for conversion than literally what existed a year ago. So something like that is deeply catalytic, and it's all embedded in the City of Yes for housing zoning reform, which is now fully passed and in effect in New York. Number two, our tax incentives. So zoning is powerful, but it needs to be matched with other tools. And the tax incentives, there are two really critical ones that have passed. The first is 485X, which is the replacement program for 421A, which had expired in 2022. And the second is 467M, which is a new tax abatement that was just created for office to residential conversion. And we're seeing a lot of great results from that tax abatement. There's a lot of energy in the office to residential conversion space. I know you recently had Brian on your podcast who was, talking about GFP and its strategy relative to office to residential conversion. That tax abatement has been the key differentiator in many of these projects going forward. And we now have over 15,000 units underway for conversion. And I think we'll see that number double over the next years ahead. The third major needle mover has been the neighborhood rezonings that have been undertaken by the Department of City Planning. There are 5 neighborhood rezonings, and all of those neighborhood rezonings taken together are creating about another 50,000 unit opportunity because they are enabling more housing to be created within the as-of-right zoning framework. These are neighborhoods that span all across the city. We're talking about Bronx Metro North, Midtown South, Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, Jamaica in Queens, and Long Island City in Queens. It's expected that all of these plans will be fully passed by the end of this year. Some of them have already passed, but others are still going through their final approvals. And these plans will mean that private investment can flow into these neighborhoods and that we will see the opportunity to develop housing where, again, a year ago, that opportunity was forbidden. So by making these changes to the zoning, they remain embedded and they are now actionable by the private market. The fourth opportunity has really been around Executive Order 43, which Mayor Adams announced about 18 months ago. And that executive order was focused on how public land can be utilized for housing production. So every single city agency was asked to review their land holdings, and the EDC has really been at the tip of the spear in bringing many of these opportunities to market. We have had a whole series of RFPs that have been looking for developers, from Gansevoort Square to 100 Gold, Flushing Airport, Coney Island, just to name a few. And there's a whole stream of projects behind these. But this is all about how do we make sure that our public land is being utilized for its highest and best purpose to serve the public, which is right now making a serious dent in housing production and our housing crisis. Finally, the fifth lever is what's happening with the Charter Commission and will be on the ballot in November, which is housing-related ballot questions that fast-track and accelerate public review for affordable housing. So the public needs to get out and vote yes on those measures. So that is the suite of the 5 major needle movers that have been activated over the last couple of years to ensure that the moonshot is not just an idea, but that there's really a pathway to execution that is meaningful, and we're seeing really strong results from these measures.
Absolutely. And we talk about one of those, like you said, with Brian in action right now. 25% of the units at 25 Water are affordable thanks to 467M. And love to go through some of these, as we discuss different initiatives underway right now with the EDC. So you're leading some of the most ambitious projects in the city right now that show how public and private investment can reinforce one another. So let's start in Queens with Willets Point. 2,500 affordable housing units are being built, which I think is the largest grouping of affordable housing in the last 40 years to be put up. And on top of that, you're going to have New York's first purpose-built professional soccer stadium. So tell us more about that project.
Willets is such a great example of public-private partnership excellence in action. I mean, first is to say that this project, the idea to redevelop Willets Point has been around for decades. And, projects that are this significant, we're talking about 60 acres of land that needed to be assembled, that needed to be remediated. This is an area that had massive environmental degradation. This was, the Valley of Ashes, filled with chop shops. And this was a neighborhood that had long suffered neglect. It took, under the leadership of Bloomberg and de Blasio and now Adams, to get to the point where we now have land assemblage that has been completed. Actually, the EDC really led those efforts. This is an example of how, the EDC can sort of clear the path for then the partnership with the private sector. We led the environmental remediation work. We have been responsible for putting new infrastructure into this district. This district needed new sewers, new water mains, new sidewalks, new streets. I mean, every level of infrastructure needed to be brought into this neighborhood, in order to activate it for the private investment. And after decades, we're seeing that this is now at a place where Adams and the EDC were really able to come together to announce a new vision for Willets. And that vision is 2,500 units of housing. This was sort of double what was really envisioned under the last plan. And all 2,500 units of this housing will be 100% affordable. So this is really an acknowledgement that, yes, we need housing. We also need affordable housing. And the government was delivering the resources in terms of the tax-exempt bonds and the subsidies to make sure that we were reaching to the right levels of AMIs, area median income, as we were thinking about, the types of renters and tenants that would need to come into a project like this. In addition, the catalyst at the center of this all is New York City's first soccer-specific stadium. And there was a real opportunity to think about this, not just as, a series of housing developments, but really as creating a whole neighborhood. And when you think about neighborhood creation and neighborhood planning, you really need to think about a whole mixture of uses. How are we bringing jobs? How are we bringing, culture, community, vitality? What about schools? What about open space? That is what this Willets Point vision is. And that is why this project is such a profound example of public-private partnership in action. So New York City Football Club is a Major League Soccer team. It's New York City's Major League Soccer team that right now, if you want to watch them play soccer, you have to watch them do that on a baseball diamond. because there is not a venue within New York City that can accommodate them until now. But a critical part of this was also enabling and ensuring that we were getting the right mix of public and private investment. And so I'm also proud to say that this soccer stadium is, the first 100% privately financed stadium and sports facility in New York, and that it's going to deliver incredible amount of economic benefits, 14,000 construction jobs, 550 permanent jobs. It's going to be animated and activated with soccer and other types of community events. You can imagine professional soccer happening here, as well as hosting, perhaps in the future, women's soccer, collegiate soccer. There's so many ways in which sports can be such a catalyst for community building. And we're seeing that the world's borough, which is Queens, its most famous nickname, deserves a home for the world's sport. And that's what we have been able to deliver here. And it's not just a vision, because it's already under construction. In fact, we announced this deal in late 2022, and we're already breaking ground on the housing by 2023. That housing is actually going to be move-in ready by spring of next year, 2026. The soccer stadium is well under construction. That broke ground in 2024 and is going to be ready for the 2027 MLS season. So this is about getting big projects moving again and showing New York that we can do big things, we can do catalytic things. Willets is an amazing example of that.
It is an incredible example, and I can't wait to go watch some games there. While we're still in Queens, tell us a little about the former Flushing Airport. It's 66 acres and one of the city's largest underutilized parcels. What's the vision for bringing that back into productive use?
So I'm glad you brought up Flushing Airport, because it's part of this Executive Order 43. And, it's been sitting there for 40 years vacant. It has not literally been an airfield for 40 years. And at this stage, the entire site has really almost like reverted to nature. So this is a prime example of, we're in the middle of a housing crisis. There are no easy sites. We have to take bold action, and we have to work to really bring public-private partnership, public-private investment to figure out how to activate sites that are admittedly challenging sites. This site has wetlands. This site has, needs to go through a full, environmental and community review process. But what we have been able to do is solicit, proposals from the market. We got a great response and have actually already announced the designation of Cirrus Workforce Housing and LCOR as the developers for this project. We announced that in July of 2025. Construction is expected to start after moving through a full entitlement and review process, hopefully by 2028. And what's envisioned here are housing units, workforce housing units. We think that 3,000 housing units can go here. We also think that there's an opportunity to really restore some of the wetlands and open it up and make it accessible for the community, because the site has really been quite closed off in those 40 years. So, just another example that there's no easy sites in the city, but by working in partnership, we can really start to unpack these opportunities, unpack the risk factors involved, and bring the right type of investment to these sites.
Over in Brooklyn, you've got the Brooklyn Army Terminal, once the largest military supply base in the world, or in the US, I should say, which is another landmark project. How are you reimagining that space today?
This is an interesting site because this is actually part of our asset management portfolio, meaning that we have about 64 million square feet that you referenced in the introduction, that the EDC is responsible for actively managing and guiding and redeveloping. And I would say in many ways, the Brooklyn Army Terminal is, one of our true, crown jewels in that portfolio. Yes, it was developed as an Army base back in 1919. It played a huge role in World War II in deploying both men and materials. Elvis Presley famously deployed from this site. So, there's a fascinating history here. But then, the base was closed, or the site was closed, and for years fell into disrepair and disinvestment. The EDC was able to come into the equation and take ownership of this site and active management of this site in the early 90s and has invested, together with the city, hundreds of millions of dollars of reimagining and adaptively reusing something that was very specific to another use for army supply and translating that into its modern context, which is really around advanced manufacturing. When you think about adaptive reuse, you really have to think about what is unique to this site that could not exist in other places. And we have incredibly strong and robust bones in this building, great pounds per square foot in terms of, the concrete floors and lots of loading docks. And over time, we have really repositioned this 4 million square foot campus into something that is now vibrant with small businesses and large businesses, actually both, about 100 businesses in total. And about 4,000 people show up for work here every day and call that the home of their business activities. We're actually bringing more investment to this area and have at this stage plans to invest about another couple $100 million into needed repairs, upgrades, elevator upgrades, window upgrades, energy efficiency measures. And I'm really excited about the role that is going to continue to play as an engine for economic opportunity within Sunset Park and on the South Brooklyn waterfront.
Great. You've emphasized that New York's economic future isn't just about its skyline, but also its 520 miles of coastline. How is the EDC reimagining the harbor and New York City's waterways as an engine of growth?
This is such a great question because, of course, New York City was really founded and grew to its prominence as a harbor town. Its whole history is really around the waterfront. That changed in the 70s when, manufacturing jobs evaporated, a lot of outsourcing, and a lot of this coastline fell into disrepair and neglect. A lot of that has changed over the years with investments in previous administrations around bringing open space and housing to the waterfront. And we have been really focused on also integrating jobs and business investment into those areas as well. And what's happening at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal is really an exciting example of this in action. We are creating there, together with Equinor, the largest offshore wind port in the United States. It's a 70-ish acre piece of dirt that is being transformed with about $100 million investment by the city, matched by $1 billion investment by Equinor, who is a very significant offshore wind developer and has been an extraordinary partner to the city, and not only redeveloping the port, but they're also going to be out at sea putting in 54 turbines, which will be enough to power 500,000 homes in Brooklyn. That's about half of all of the homes in Brooklyn. So this is an extraordinary engine, not only for jobs and for supply chain, but also really thinking about the amount of energy that can be delivered from the creation of these this new form of energy of offshore wind. And so, the EDC's role here is, yes, about a project, but it's really about creating an industry. And when we think about getting involved in something like this, we're thinking about how can this project be catalytic for what we hope is a whole stream of projects that will exist around offshore wind. We've been working very closely together with our partners at the state at NYCERDA. That has been, that put out a target for offshore wind production of 9 gigawatts. That target, given some federal context, has certainly slowed. But this first project is still going to be the shot in the arm that's really going to get this industry kickstarted. And we're very excited not only about the physical transformation, but also the funding that's gone towards innovation. A whole ecosystem of new marine-related technology companies has formed around this site through some of the piloting programs and innovation accelerator programs that Equinor has helped fund together with the EDC, and also workforce programs. So we also need to train people for these, new skills in welding and in electrical engineering and marine-based construction. So this is all a part of our green economy, and we think that as New York City really transitions into more and more green energy over time, that there's going to be an incredible economic opportunity that is really unleashed within the city. And this site and Sunset Park in particular is going to play a huge role in the jobs that are going to get created from that green transition.
Just across the harbor, EDC also has ambitious plans for the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, an even larger former bustling cargo and shipping terminal in Red Hook, with a proposed $3.5 billion redevelopment. What should we expect over there?
Well, I am very excited about what is happening with the Brooklyn Marine Terminal redevelopment. This is a city-defining project. It's 122 acres that the EDC was able to acquire from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey about 18 months ago. Many, many mayors have long wished for this to occur, and we were able to get it done. And not only to acquire the site, but to work extensively through a community-driven process and a task force to put out a vision plan for this 122 acres that envisions about half of the site, 60 acres, for a modern, all-electric maritime port, and about 60 acres for housing. So this task force has now actually voted, and there was a supermajority vote of the task force, which has now approved, as of just a couple of weeks ago, the vision plan for this project, which means that it will now start into the environmental review and public entitlement process. It's 6,000 new homes that can get created here. So, when we think about, again, how are we using publicly held land? We need to really get creative. Right now, the site is vacant. It's largely fallow. Many of the piers have fallen into the water. We need to bring new ideas, new vision, and new investment into these, into these sites. We can't claim that we're doing all we can around housing without looking really closely at the holdings of government and thinking about how they can be better utilized. And this is a great example of that. I think also, interestingly enough, this is a vision plan that really couldn't have happened 20 years ago. And the reason why is that now we know that through, electrification, that you can now have a modern maritime port that is quieter, that's cleaner, where you can co-locate it with housing. These are, some of the ways in which, innovation and technology is actually going to improve and integrate the different aspects of our city in a way that couldn't have been done a generation ago. So we will have modern maritime uses co-located with housing, with new parks and open space. 40% of the housing will be permanently affordable. There's also going to be neighborhood-related amenities, new commercial spaces, community spaces. This is an integrated neighborhood plan, and there's going to be a lot of action around this plan in the years ahead as it moves through the next stages of realization.
Beyond real estate and infrastructure, the EDC also catalyzes growth in innovation sectors like life sciences, the green economy, which you've talked about, AI, and advanced manufacturing. How do you decide which sectors to prioritize, and how do you nurture their growth into full ecosystems?
Well, the EDC has been at this for 40 years since our founding. And I think that we're seeing the results of these efforts, which is, a generation ago, people would have really thought of New York exclusively as a finance center. And while finance is still our bedrock, with 350,000 jobs, and actually we've seen even growth in finance jobs since COVID. We now know New York City as also a center for tech, a center for life sciences, for health, for film and entertainment, and of course our green economy. So what is the strength of New York is really the fact that it is so diversified economically. It's what enables us when there is a disruption in one part of the market. As an example, we've seen a lot of pullback in VC funding for life sciences over the last couple of years. And that's been very meaningful in places like Boston and, San Francisco and San Diego that don't benefit from as broad of an economic diversification as New York City does. So we would like to see all of these areas that are really tied to innovation. And I think that that's the core theme here, is that New York City is focused on growing innovation sectors. These sectors are high growth and they're high wage. So just to give you a sense of how well this is working, in technology, we've seen 72% growth in tech jobs from a decade ago. And how does the city do this? Through a whole different suite of ecosystem building tools. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is EDC is behind the Cornell Tech development on Roosevelt Island. This was an RFP that was put out in the Bloomberg years, and this campus is still getting built and created and invested in. But Cornell Tech, which is a combination of Cornell and Technion, has established a science and engineering campus on Roosevelt Island. They have generated a significant number of new companies that have taken some of the technology that is being discovered in those classrooms and with those researchers, and they're forming companies around them. And those companies are overwhelmingly staying and locating in New York City. So this is, one way in which we do that. We also fund different types of accelerators, and we run a piloting program at our back campus where we help small-scale entrepreneurs test their new technologies in large format areas, like at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, where we can give access to our buildings and to our waterfronts and make sure that we can help them solve problems as they look to scale technology into the built environment.
So an example of that is BatWorks, the climate innovation hub that anchors your green economy plan.
That's exactly right. And BatWorks is another example of how we're doing this work. BatWorks will be 200,000 square feet hub that is going to get created at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. We just announced this year after doing a global search for our private, academic partners that would come together and establish this with $100 million of city investment. So we partnered with LACY, which is the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, and CIC, which is the Cambridge Innovation Center. And together, they're our partners in creating this hub, which will house over 150 startups over 10 years. It will generate 600 jobs, $2.6 billion in economic impact. We have a lot of ambitions for the role that this BatWorks is going to play within the green economy and in the clean energy transition. And I think, excitingly, this is not just an effort in isolation. So the city has also created what we refer to as the Harbor Climate Collaborative, which is a collaboration of the EDC, the Climate Exchange on Governor's Island, and the climate-related businesses like New Lab in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so once the city starts really using the might and the muscle of aggregating all of these different investments, which are, by the way, all on former military bases, all are connected via New York City ferry system, you realize why New York City is now poised to become the center of gravity for climate innovation globally. So this is a very exciting initiative. It is really just getting off the ground now. We're putting together designs and plans for all of the physical transformation that will occur, and many of the initiatives around workforce and piloting and making the connections with other community and academic partners are already well underway. So stay tuned for more.
Will do. And I think it's quite appropriate that Gotham City should have, BatWorks as a centerpiece of its renaissance. But on a more serious note, I'd love to go through all of this with, continue discussing all of your different projects, for the next several hours. But as we wrap up, I wanted to, ask if you have any personal recommendations that are not real estate related, whether that's a book, a philosophy, a work of art, or a life hack that inspires you?
Raphael, I love this question. It is one of my favorite part of all of your podcasts. And so I have for you something that has been truly meaningful for me as a book, a life hack, and a philosophy. So I've got three in one here, which is Carol Dweck and her groundbreaking book called Mindset, The New Psychology of Success, which was published in 2006. I was really first introduced to it through my children's schools. But to be honest, this is a book that applies to business and life and is all about really embracing lifelong learning, which to me is such a huge form of motivation and is all really about reframing challenges as opportunities to learn. So, the growth mindset is, versus a fixed mindset. If you, think that people are born with certain gifts versus thinking that you are a work in progress, that you can be developed through effort and learning. So I find this to be incredibly motivating because, I think about every situation as an opportunity to learn. It makes life more expansive. When I think about even, other people's successes, instead of, comparing myself, instead I get curious and I say, what can I learn from this? What can I learn from them? And it really reframes everyone around you to become a teacher. So I've adopted this mindset for quite a while now. It's been very motivating, and I'm happy to share it with you and your listeners.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much for sharing such a thoughtful and meaningful example. I really want to thank you for spending the time joining us. Your work shows how public and private investment can reinforce each other to keep New York globally competitive, equitable, and growing.
Thank you so much, Raphael.